Welcome back, everyone. We are going to continue our discussion on virtual WAN by now talking about how virtual WAN integrates with hybrid networks. In this lesson, we'll start off with the big picture concepts of how hybrid connections work in virtual WAN, talk about the main exam point we're going to focus on, which is going to be scale units. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Go over the general hybrid connection process. It is a little bit different depending on site-to-site and point-to-site VPN or express route, but there are some high-level processes you should be familiar with. And then we'll finish up with a really quick demo exploring some of the hybrid connection options in a live virtual WAN environment. Jumping on into it, big picture view of working with hybrid connections. Hybrid connectivity is, of course, our site-to-site and point-to-site VPN connections, and also working with ExpressRoute for a private connection. Many of the same principles will apply to our previous sections on these hybrid connection topics, although there are a few key differences compared to our non-managed virtual network implementation that you do need to be aware of. One of those differences is that our connections are created inside of our virtual hub. Also, the site-to-site and point-to-site VPN configurations and the gateways for that matter are completely separate. In other words, we create a separate site-to-site VPN gateway, which is not the same as a point-to-site VPN gateway. They're two separate products. Also, be aware that the configuration process is different between our different connection types, and that some of our configurations can be created inside of the virtual hub interface, and other ones can only be created in the virtual WAN interface outside of the hub, from which we will then apply that created configuration inside the hub itself. From an exam perspective, you do not need to memorize that, although it will be good to point out when we are going through our demonstration here in just a second. And then our last difference, which is really going to be a main focus and is specifically an exam focus, is that from a SKU perspective, even though it is not specifically referred to as a SKU, we configure our throughput or our bandwidth for our different hybrid connections using something known as scale units. Let's talk about scale units in some more detail. So you can most easily think of scale units as your bandwidth SKU. Again, it's not specifically referred to as a SKU, but it is kind of the same purpose. A scale unit is assigned to each of your hybrid connections, which provides or assigns the aggregate throughput or the bandwidth of that specific connection unit. And again, by connection unit, we are talking about site-to-site and point-to-site VPN connections and ExpressRoute as well. Now, very important point is that a scale unit measurement is different if we're talking about VPN or ExpressRoute. What I mean by this is that if we are working with either site-to-site or point-to-site VPN, each of those scale units gives you 500 megabits of aggregate bandwidth. However, a single ExpressRoute scale unit is 2 gigabits per second per individual scale unit. So again, a scale unit is a different measurement depending on if we are talking about VPN or ExpressRoute. To highlight this, let's consider the following example scenario. Let's say that we have a requirement in which we need to support 5 gigabits per second of ExpressRoute traffic to our branch offices connected to a single virtual hub. Now the question would be in this case, how many scale units would you need to select in order to fulfill this requirement? Well, let's break this down. If an individual ExpressRoute scale unit is 2 gigabits per second per scale unit, to meet our requirement of 5 gigabits per second of ExpressRoute bandwidth, we would need to choose 3 ExpressRoute scale units for this specific scenario, which would give us 6 total, which is slightly above the 5 gigabits requirement that we need to have. In this case, we would have an extra gigabit per second left over as a bit of a bonus because we cannot break down to 1 gigabit per second per scale unit. Moving on, let's take a really high-level overview of the general hybrid connection process within a virtual hub. And for this example, we're going to use a site-to-site VPN for our example. Step 1 would be to create the VPN site connection within our virtual hub. In this case, we would assign scale units. And again, as a general reminder, VPN uses 500 megabits per second per scale unit. After we assign our scale unit, we would then need to create the site configuration, in other words, the equivalent of a local network gateway for a site-to-site VPN gateway within the hub configuration. Now, quick side note, when working with site-to-site VPN, we can either create the configuration in the hub itself, or we can also create the configuration outside the hub. The idea is that we could apply the same configuration to multiple hubs, and then within our hub connection settings, we can merely apply the already created configuration we set up in advance. Then next, after we either create a site configuration or apply an existing one, we will then simply initiate that connection to our local VPN device on some sort of an on-premises network. After which, our next step is to configure the local VPN device to connect to our virtual hub. And again, the process is a little bit different compared to our unmanaged network gateways. In this case, within our virtual hub settings, we would download a VPN configuration file and then import that configuration file into our local VPN device or router, which would automatically pair our local VPN device with our virtual hub. And then just like that, we have a working connection. Very good. Wrapping things up in this lesson, let's go through a quick hands-on demonstration in our own dedicated Azure tenant of exploring some of the hybrid connection options. We're not going to go really super in-depth, and we're not going to connect to any live networks. However, I did just want to take a look at how the setup works for your different hybrid connectivity options. Specifically, I wanted to point out what hybrid connection options let you create a configuration inside of the hub, and which ones require a configuration to be created outside of the hub, and then applied to that connection type inside the hub. Sounds a little confusing? Let's go and jump over to our Azure tenant and let's see what we're talking about. Okay, we are now in our dedicated Azure tenant. This is not going to be a Playgrounds demo follow along. Rather, I'm just going to be working with my own tenant. And I already have a virtual WAN up and running. And I also have a virtual hub that I've also created in advance for specifically this demonstration. Also for this demo, I've also pre-created a couple network gateways, specifically our site-to-site network gateway inside of our hub, because once again, it takes about 20 to 30 minutes to complete, and I just wanted to get that out of the way. So first thing I want to do, I want to get straight into the hub itself and take a look at some of the hybrid connectivity options we're going to be working with. I'll go ahead and click on our hub one right here. And inside of here, we have a little dashboard of the status of our different hybrid connectivity settings. Notice we have a site-to-site VPN gateway already provisioned. This is the one that I created in advance. However, we have not created a gateway for our user or point-to-site VPN or express route gateways as well. And for this example, we're not doing anything with Azure Firewall or network virtual appliances either. What I want to take a look at inside of the hub is our different gateway setups, specifically looking at scale units, and also as a side note, looking on whether or not we can create a configuration inside of it. Let's go ahead and start with our VPN gateway by clicking on it, specifically the site-to-site one. Now, since I created this one in advance, I was able to assign some gateway scale units, and notice here that I have a single scale unit applied to this VPN site-to-site network gateway, which again shows that we're doing 500 megabits per second. Now, for our site-to-site VPN gateway inside the hub, we could create the gateway without first applying a configuration. We have the ability to do that after the fact. Let's go ahead and create a fake one now to an on-prem network that doesn't exist, but we will go ahead and make up some values so we can go ahead and set a configuration. In this example, at the very bottom, I'm going to go ahead and create a new VPN site. And for these examples, we're going to create configurations to local routers, not another Azure network that we are connecting over site-to-site VPN. And let's just quickly fill out some example information now. We'll need to choose a region. I'm going consistently with Central US for these demos. Provide a name to our site. We'll just call it my on-prem site. Very creative. And we need to choose a device vendor. This actually doesn't do or configure anything. This is basically just a marker so we know what device vendor, like Cisco or whatever else, we're working with when creating our connection. I'll just put in Cisco here. And for this example, I'm not going to provide a private address space. Let's go ahead and go over to links. And this is where we would provide our local link information to our site-to-site router that we're connecting to. I'm going to go ahead and populate some made-up values. Okay, and after populating some made-up on-premises values, we have a link name called Control-Alt-Suites Headquarters Link. Link speed is 500. Our link provider is going to be Verizon. We have a DNS address of our local site called vpn.controlaltsuites.com and a made-up BGP address and ASN value that you see right here. Let's go ahead and click on Review and Create. And then click on Create, and that'll be up here in just a moment. Again, this is not an actual on-prem site we are going to. However, once this is complete, we will have an existing connection waiting for confirmation that it works from our non-existent on-premises side. Okay, and after about 30 seconds or so, my non-existent on-premises site configuration is up and working. If I want to back up and go back to our virtual WAN, we can go ahead and check on that VPN configuration information. Go back into our virtual WAN, go back to our hub, back to site, And then once we remove our filter of connected to this hub, we have our configuration we just created. Now we just need to go ahead and connect it to this actual hub, in which case we'll hit the checkbox by My On-Prem Site, click on VPN Sites, and in this case I'll type in a made-up pre-shared key called My Secret. Again, please never use that in production. And then click on Connect. And just like that, our virtual hub is now connected over a site-to-site connection to a non-existent local location, from which our final step would be to download our VPN configuration that you can see there in the top left, and we would then import that into our local VPN router device. Last thing I want to show real quick, just to round things out, is I wanted to take a look at User VPN just to highlight the differences in the configuration setup. If I click on User VPN, and then attempt to create a User VPN gateway, I can go ahead and assign my scale units. However, I cannot create my configuration inside of the hub itself. I can only select an existing configuration. In this case, I went ahead and duplicated the configuration we use in the point-to-site VPN demonstration. And then from there, I would fill out the other usual information such as client address pool, again, very similar to our previous demonstration and teachings on point-to-site VPN. I'm not going to go ahead and create this connection for demonstration's sake. The one thing I want to point out is that this is actually a configuration you have to set up outside of the hub. Specifically, if we go into our virtual WAN settings and then go to user VPN configurations, again, not part of our hub, but in the virtual WAN interface, we would create our configuration inside of there, and from there we would then apply that to the hub itself. So depending on your connection type, the process is just different enough to be confusing, but that just gives you a quick heads up of what we're dealing with. With that, that's going to go ahead and wrap up this overview of integrating hybrid connections with our virtual WAN. Let's review our key takeaways and then move on. In this lesson, we covered the general process of how hybrid connections work within virtual WANs, including the differences when working with individual virtual networks, such as separate site-to-site and point-to-site configurations. We also discussed probably the biggest point in this lesson, at least from an exam perspective, which is scale units, in which you need to know that VPN scale units are 500 megabits per second each, and an express route scale unit by comparison is 2 gigabits per second each. And from there, we covered the high-level site-to-site connection process, in which we start by creating a gateway and assigning our scale units, creating or assigning an existing VPN site configuration to our site connection, and then once our connection is up and working, then downloading and importing that configuration to the local VPN device itself. That's going to go ahead and wrap up this lesson. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one.